You're listening to the Drift And Ramble Podcast, true stories and American legends.
The Drift and Ramble Podcast is sponsored by Hypervape. Hypervape.com.
This is Season 1, Episode 2. Welcome. I'm Steve Blizin. In the previous episode, we learned about the bumbling criminal exploits of outlaw Elmer McCurdy. His record was so bad that he should have been forgotten, lost to the annals of time immemorial, at least compared to other well-known outlaws of the Old West. McCurdy had everything against him from the start. To begin with, his criminal escapades didn't even start until 1911, hardly the time we remember as the heydays of the Old West. Indeed, McCurdy may have been the last of the Old West outlaws, but his crimes were so pathetic, no outlaw wanted to claim him. Some men chose the six-gun, others chose the mask, but Elmer McCurdy's tool of choice was nitroglycerin, the most unstable, unpredictable explosive known to man. How he didn't blow himself up is a miracle, and that he couldn't succeed in his short and unproductive career of robbery is perhaps its own crime. But Elmer McCurdy died after his third and failed train robbery. And that is when things got weird. Sent to the Johnson Funeral Home for burial, the mortician made a fateful choice by embalming Elmer with a toxic arsenic-based embalming procedure that preserved his body with startling success. And as fast as the bullet that killed him, McCurdy was rocketed to fame. Elmer's body was displayed at the Johnson Funeral Home in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, where folks paid a fee to view him. It seemed the mortician had found a way to cash in on the Oklahoma Bandit's demise. What's odd is that wasn't really all that unusual. Perhaps it was a sign of the times. And this is where we pick up the story. What could Johnson have been thinking to preserve the bandit in this way? But Johnson had his reasons. He knew McCurdy died an outlaw, and perhaps he posited no kinfolk would come to claim him, so he hatched a plan to cash in on Elmer's newfound notoriety. You see, the press was now touting McCurdy as something more than the sum of his clumsy, non-profit 9-month crime spree. In the Fort Scott Tribune, they referred to McCurdy as a notable criminal and leader of a gang of outlaws who have held up and robbed trains and banks and committed much of the outlawry of the past few years. With the press all abuzz, public interest in the well-preserved cadaver on display in Johnson's funeral home hit a fevered pitch, and Johnson reaped the rewards by charging admission to view the corpse. Elmer McCurdy had become a working stiff. He wasn't the first to find fame and fortune in the afterlife. Of course, the difference here was that McCurdy was a real outlaw. Before Elmer, other famous stiffs were mostly fakes, touted as the real thing. In 1899, the petrified remains of Civil War General Thomas Francis Meagher turned up in Fort Bennington, Montana. But it turned out that the real General Meagher actually died in Missouri after a bit of hard drinking and an accidental fall off a steamboat in 1867. Fabled swindler Soapy Smith may have had the most successful of the petrified man hoaxes, though. His stiff, known as McGinty, or sometimes called Colonel Stone, was indeed a real corpse, preserved with the same arsenic-based embalming fluid that was used on Elmer McCurdy. Perhaps it was from here where Johnson got his inspiration. Even the more obvious fakes, like the Cardiff Giant, for instance, took in plenty of money. In 1869, when a wealthy tobacco seller named George Hull set about to win an argument with a clergyman, Hull purchased a block of granite from Iowa, hired a stone carver from Chicago, and shipped the resulting carving to New York, where Hull's cousin buried it on his property. The carving lay beneath ground for about a year before two well diggers conveniently uncovered the giant manolith. Soon, Hull's cousin set up a tent over the site and began charging admission. People lined up and paid money to see the thing. When the Cardiff giant was sold, for a whopping sum of $37,000, and shipped off to Syracuse, it drew even more crowds. P.T. Barnum tried to buy it. But when the new owner wouldn't sell, Barnum hired a sculptor and had his own version created. He called his fake the real giant. Offended by Barnum's obvious fake, the original giant's owner sued. But the judge wisely ruled that you can't sue somebody else for calling your fake a fake. Both versions of the giant still exist and are still on display today. Another imitation appeared in Beulah, Colorado, and was hailed as the solid Muldoon. But that, too, turned out to be nothing more than a gross mix of plaster, ground bones, and real meat. Obviously, there was something of a market for seeing the dead. By all accounts, the papers claimed that thousands came to see the new embalmed outlaw. Some accounts had people coming from all over the United States to view the body. And even 17 years after McCurdy's death, in an article from the Pawhuska Journal, Johnson himself recounted thousands viewing the body, but no one identifying it. He added that every showman or street carnival that came to town tried to buy the body for show purposes, but were advised the body was being held in the hope that relatives would claim it. No doubt the comment was made with tongue firmly planted in cheek, as Johnson knew that Elmer was worth far more above ground than below. Locals recall that Johnson charged a nickel to view the body of McCurdy, and at one point even displayed his one-time partner, Walter Jarrett's remains, along with McCurdy, until the Jarrett family claimed Walter's body for burial. Meanwhile, McCurdy was dressed and photographed and reposed on more than one occasion. Even Johnson's own son, Luke, recalled in a mortuary trade publication that around 6 months after the shootout, they saw that the body could be stood on its feet, and as the embalmed bandit had already become an object of local interest, we dressed him in the clothes he had worn at his last fight and stood him in the corner of our mortuary. Others recall the Johnson boys had mounted the body on roller skates as a kind of spookhouse exhibit, and still others recollected sneaking into the funeral home at night to catch a glimpse of the body after a late-night movie. Officially, the Johnson Funeral Home denied any such pandering to public demand, but there's no denying that McCurdy had become a celebrity of sorts. After 5 years continuing in his unclaimed status at the Johnson Funeral Home, McCurdy's notoriety eventually reached the Patterson brothers. Charles Patterson, a traveling salesman and resident of the town of Pawhuska, was so inclined to inform his brother James Patterson, a carnival owner who just happened to be in town with his troupe, and the two men devised a plan to claim old Elmer as their own. The plan was well thought out and executed flawlessly. According to Johnson's son, Johnny, a man claiming to be the long-lost brother of Elmer McCurdy, contacted and convinced the sheriff and the county attorney that he was the rightful heir to Elmer's body, and Johnson had no choice but to relinquish the remains. Within 2 weeks, word arrived that Elmer was now on display as part of a street carnival in West Texas. Deceived by confidence men and a careful ruse, Elmer was back among the lawless. For a dead guy, Elmer sure did get around. For 6 years, Elmer traveled all over creation, touted and displayed as the Oklahoma outlaw. When McCurdy finally did resurface, it was in Washington State at Louis Sony's Wax Museum of Crime. The year was 1922, and Elmer had been uninterned since 1911. As it turned out, McCurdy's body had been leveraged as collateral against a loan. When the carnival hack defaulted on the loan, the well-preserved McCurdy became the property of Mr. Sony, a one-time police officer who was well accustomed in taking in bandits with lengthy criminal histories. The Roaring Twenties came and went. Flappers, the age of the automobile, Prohibition, the Great Depression, gangsters of the 1930s, all came and went. And World War II, the Korean War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the space race, all came and went. Sony, also a fledgling filmmaker, eventually traveled to Los Angeles and employed McCurdy to promote a few films before actually casting him in one. Standing him up in the lobby prior to the showing of a film, or outside to draw attention, McCurdy never protested. He did, finally, at one point, appear in Sony's anti-drug film called March of Crime. Elmer appeared only briefly, perhaps not surprisingly, as the "what can happen" as a result of drug abuse. Eventually, the long-dead, but never buried, outlaw from Oklahoma wound up in the Cordova Street offices of Sony Amusement Enterprises in Los Angeles, as the Wax Museum of Crime had long since been dismantled. Sony's son, Dan, had inherited his father's business, and with it, Elmer. Sometime in 1964, Dan Sony and Dave Friedman, a man notorious for his exploitation films and tactics that are legend in their own right, formed a long-lasting partnership. That Sony had known or known of Elmer McCurdy for his entire lifetime might have made it bittersweet to part ways, but part ways they did eventually do. Sometime in the late 60s, the wax figures, stuffed alligators, and mummified remains were sold. Dan did seem to enjoy Elmer's grotesque presence, though. Friedman said that Dan would take great pleasure in introducing almost anyone who stopped by the office to Elmer, and Dan himself spoke of a time when he broke off Elmer's arm and chased his secretary around the office with it. He said later he reattached the arm with some electrician's tape. But now, as the sale of the final remnants of his father's business were underway, a trio of Canadian speculators came through and purchased Elmer, along with much of the remaining inventory. And now, with this sale, Elmer had lost all connection to his identity. He was just another prop, a hideous effigy of a man with no name and no history. The men had various interests in wax museum enterprises, but felt Elmer, well, he was just too gross to display. He stood there, stoically, collecting dust, with no opinion on the topic, quietly closeted away. A few years passed, and finally, one of the men found use for Elmer as the 1,000-year-old man. He constructed a box and drilled 2 holes into Elmer's remains, one in his neck and one in his foot. A strange, gooey, yellow substance oozed from the foot, but the man continued, seemingly undaunted. He arranged Elmer's body in such a way that it would shake and twitch inside the box as a way to attract people into the wax museum. But by September of 1972, the rent on the wax museum had gone unpaid far too long, and Elmer was confiscated by the Long Beach Amusement Company. Elmer was once again stored in a closet at the company's electrician's apartment. Hardly a place you'd want to hang your coat. Then, the company decided to revamp the old laugh-in-the-dark funhouse ride at the Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach, California. The electrician dug Elmer out of his closet and hung his body from the ceiling. He painted him a bright day-glow red and installed a switch that would illuminate a blue light to spook visitors as they came around the corner to confront this hideous sight. Over the next 4 years, throngs of people screamed at every sight of Elmer, and their high-pitched wails fell upon his own deaf ears. As the park itself continued to decline, Elmer McCurdy had reached rock bottom. He was nothing more than a nameless prop, hanging by his neck, tortured for the amusement of others. Then, on the morning of December 7th, 1976, a chain of events was unfolding that would eventually settle the matter of Elmer McCurdy once and for all. According to the Los Angeles Times, paramedics dispatched from the Long Beach Fire Department rushed through the mid-morning traffic towards the Pike Amusement Park to respond to a call for help. A case of severe dehydration, the reporting party had said. Upon arrival, they were met by the fire safety officer for a television production crew, setting up shots for an upcoming episode of the popular TV series, The $6 Million Man. Here, they were led to the unidentified mummified remains, the victim of this severe dehydration. And laughter once again exploded within the walls of this funhouse ride. It seemed the film crew had discovered the human remains quite accidentally when the mummy was about to be removed from its makeshift noose so the crew could film. A man named Chris Haynes had accidentally snapped off its arm and noticed, curiously, that it wasn't made of papier-mâché as he had expected. Upon further inspection, it certainly did look human. Chris led an off-duty police officer to the scene, and the officer's comment was simply, "Just what Long Beach needs, another dead sailor." Then he walked outside, laughing. The crew's fire safety officer noticed the laughing cop and asked what he was chuckling about. The cop replied, "We got a body in there." And perhaps, with some degree of suppressed laughter, paramedics were called to the scene. The arm and the body would be delivered to the county coroner's office, where it would be positively identified as human remains. The identity of the human to which it belonged still a mystery. It was here, under the careful scrutiny of Los Angeles County Coroner Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the very same doctor who had autopsied the bodies of celebrities like Marilyn Monroe, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and John Belushi, and so many other icons of the time, began that slow and deliberate process of discovering not only the cause of death, but, if at all possible, the identity of who this mummified body actually was. Dr. Choi was assigned to the case and quickly went to work sorting out the details. Through modern forensics, ballistic science, and dogged persistence, Elmer was eventually reunited with his identity. After learning of his story, Elmer McCurdy was once again a famous dead guy. He had indeed become the outlaw that wouldn't give up. 66 years had passed from the time when Elmer had been killed until his positive identification by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. 66 years roaming the earth without a single utterance, and knowing nearly every indignity known to man, living or dead. Of all the years he remained above ground, he spent most either on his feet or hanging by his neck. In the early days when people paid to see him, they inserted coins and tickets in his mouth. In fact, a coin from 1922 and several ticket stubs from Sony's Wax Museum of Crime were found still lodged in Elmer's mouth. But now that he was positively identified, the final indignity of all loomed above him like a threat. After such a public reuniting with his name, the L.A. County coroner was tasked with relinquishing or disposing of the body. Unclaimed bodies, John or Jane Doe's, were commonly cremated by the county as storage space was, and still is, extremely limited for the dead. After all this time, to be turned to ash and shoveled from a furnace and scattered in the wind seemed an unfitting end for the outlaw who wouldn't give up. Again, fate played its hand and dealt Elmer a final resting place. The long and tragic comedy of Elmer McCurdy's life and death was finally coming to an end. In the long and serpentine path to resolution, Elmer McCurdy was finally claimed by, and laid to rest in, the great state of Oklahoma. When men from the Oklahoma Historical Society made their case to County Coroner Noguchi, he advised them of the seriousness of their request and insisted on respect for the long-dead outlaw. No shenanigans, no circus tent displays, he warned. With the men swearing to uphold McCurdy's honor, he was finally released for burial. You can visit Elmer's grave in Guthrie, Oklahoma, if you're so inclined. He's buried at the Summit View Cemetery. His body lies near the outlaw Bill Doolin's, along with other notorious Doolin gang outlaws. In the end, 66 years after his death, Elmer McCurdy was finally laid to rest, permanently below ground, and known as a true outlaw of the Old West. And perhaps that is all the man ever really wanted. If the single most undeniable truth about living is that nobody gets out alive, shouldn't we all at least have some dignity in death? In the end, Elmer McCurdy finally achieved what he'd been chasing most of his life. He's remembered as the outlaw who wouldn't give up, dogged persistence and determination. That's not the worst thing to be remembered for.
The Drift and Ramble Podcast is a Clear Voice Media production, hosted and produced by Steve Blizin, with segment research and voice acting by Cheryl Blizin. Additional contributions and content have been made possible by support from individuals dedicated to the art and science of storytelling and exploring the still fertile promise of the American West.
We'll be back after this message. Come on, Billy. Let's ride out after them bandits that robbed the train. Hang on a second, Clem. My vaporizer won't charge. Now how am I going to have a smoke? Well, Billy, it looks like you should have chose Hypervape. When it comes to e-cigarettes, why settle for something you picked up in the back of a saloon? But Clem, I spent a lot of money on this thing. How much you spend isn't how you measure quality. You measure quality through reliability, longevity, and value. Like this old horse your mom sold me. Gee, I guess you have been riding her a long time. You mean this horse or your mom? Why don't you mosey on over to hypervape.com and place an order, Billy? Old Paint and I will catch up to those bandits. Remember, hypervape.com. Sleek, discreet, and always reliable. That's hypervape.com. Where outlaws and good guys find quality. Many resources were utilized in researching the life and death of Elmer McCurdy, but one in particular deserves high praise. Author Mark Svengold's book, Elmer McCurdy, the misadventures and life and afterlife of an American outlaw. It proved to be the most comprehensive accounting of Elmer McCurdy's life and death available. Many interesting details abound in this story, and Mr. Svengold's work assembles them with care and compassion for Mr. McCurdy's fate. If you'd like to learn more about Elmer McCurdy, may I suggest that you begin with Mr. Svengold's book. Until we meet again, I'm Steve Blizin. See you at the next installment of the Drift and Ramble Podcast.